Welcome. Thank you for joining us for our program. My name is Helen Liu, and I'm the Programming and Partnerships Manager at Cary Library. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank the Cary Library Foundation. Their support enables us to bring programs like tonight's event to you. This program is being recorded and will be posted to the library's YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please submit them to the Q&A or chat, and Bruce will answer them at the end of the program. Tonight, we'll explore sites in the region that are off the beaten path. Our speaker tonight is Bruce Magnuson. After retiring from a career in financial services, Bruce pursued his interests in photography, art, and history. He has had photographs in multiple shows at the Griffin Museum in Winchester and various other venues, including a solo show featuring his infrared photographs at the Acton Library. Bruce has studied at the New England School of Photography, the Griffin Museum, the Cordova Museum, the Art Institute of Boston, and Maine Media, among other visual arts programs. Presents at various organizations on topics that feature his photography and explores subjects such as art, history, and travel, including the history of his home region, the Hudson Valley. Welcome, Bruce. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Great. Thanks, Helen. Thanks to the Cary Library for hosting this, and thanks for everyone for attending. So, as Helen said, this is going to be a tour through New England, hidden gems, a photographic journey off some locations that are off the beaten paths. Some you're probably familiar with, and I would hazard a guess some you're not. So, to kind of orient ourselves where we're going to be traveling, the little stars indicate we're going to be in central Massachusetts to start off with. We'll go east to Cape Ann, and then we'll end up in western New Hampshire, right near the New Hampshire border. So, as an agenda, we're going to talk about the Quabbin Reservoir, Dana Common, the Rutland Prison Camp, Dogtown on Cape Ann, and Madame Sherri's Forest up in New Hampshire. So I think I'll stop after each section and take a look at the Q&A and the chat and see what kind of questions, because since these are fairly distinct areas, probably makes sense to kind of address the questions as we go along after each section. So we'll do that if that's okay with folks. So we'll start off with the Quabbin Reservoir. Surveying for the reservoir began in the early 1900s, which kind of plays into the story I'm going to tell you here. It is in the Swift River Valley. Swift River is basically the river that gets dammed up that ends up creating the Quabbin. Quabbin is Nipmuc for gathering of the waters, which makes sense for a place that's going to be a reservoir. Eventually, 4 towns are generously termed removed. Greenwich, I actually think it's pronounced Greenwich, actually. Prescott, Enfield, and Dana. And Dana is the only one that we can visit, so we'll take a look at that today. It was completed in 1939, and it takes 7 years for it to fully flood. So the actual Quabbin is not full capacity until 1946, right after World War II. Holds 412 billion gallons of water. And for you folks in Lexington, it is the source, or one of the sources for the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority, the famous or infamous, depending upon your view, MWRA. I lived in Melrose back in the late 90s and early 2000s. When they were talking about adding towns to the MWRA and raising the rates and all that kind of fun stuff. So that was very much in play. I live in Chelmsford now, where actually we do not get our water from the Quabbin. So this is the dam at the Quabbin. Just an earthen dam, nothing really too spectacular, but the actual watershed there is pretty amazing. It's beautiful. They have trails throughout there. All kinds of wildlife, all kinds of ranger hikes to go throughout the area. It's a large area in central Massachusetts, very long, narrow, north to south watershed. It's about, various entry points to the Quabbin from where I am in Chelmsford, about an hour and 15 minutes out to actually touch the Quabbin to go down to the southern part. It's probably closer to an hour and a half since the road's out. You're on your 2-lane windy country roads, but it's absolutely beautiful country. And this is kind of a schematic of what the MWRA is all about. You have the Quabbin out here, which is the furthest west of it. You have the Wachusett Reservoir, which we'll get to. This was created first, and then it makes its way toward Boston with various treatment, plant storage, aqueducts, big holding tanks. Folks in Lexington are out here. and it goes into Boston. And as you can see, it services the greater metro area of Boston, as well as some of the towns out here. Not as many as you might think, although I do believe there is some legislation afoot to have more of these towns actually participate in the MWRA. And I'm sure with the current drought we're under here, that's going to accelerate some of those conversations. Although I did see an article in today's Globe that's saying the Quabbin actually was at pretty good capacity as far as the water goes, even with the drought we've had. I think actually I saw in the news today that the storm we're supposed to get on Thursday will be the first 1-inch storm we've had since late June, as far as Boston goes. That is kind of crazy. So this is actually the Wachusett Dam, which comes first, and I would argue is actually the better place to visit, since and there is a visitor center to Quabbin. Like I said, the vistas are beautiful, but this is quite an elaborate public space, and you can only actually walk across this dam like once or twice a year. I think it's around Memorial Day they open it up, and I think sometimes they open up in the fall. But this whole area you can walk down. Now these are fairly steep steps, and you can go up this side as well. But it's an amazing recreation area out here in Clinton, Massachusetts, and it's not that far if you're familiar with the area. Kind of around Worcester, 290. And there's I think it's called now the New England Botanical Garden at Tower Hill. But for those of you who've been around a while, the Tower Hill Botanical Gardens are not that far from here. So a lot to do out in this neck of the woods. But this is a beautiful place that I end up coming back to quite a lot. And it's an amazing public works project. Once again, this is the area for the MWRA and all the towns that are actually participating in the MWRA. And the interesting thing about the whole creation of this is when the Wachusett Reservoir gets created in the early 1900s, it's basically obsolete when they build it. So they know they're going to have to build something in addition to this. So I think it gets fully flooded in the 1910s, 1920s, but they start surveying for the Quabbin at that time. So the reason I bring that up is, the really kind of complicated story with this is these 4 towns basically get eliminated. And so, it's during the Depression, it's a tough time, all this stuff's going on. And the problem is the property values are kind of suppressed because this has been known for a long time that these towns are on the chopping blocks. Like I said, once the Wachusett is actually being built, they realize they're going to need, because of the population expansion in the Boston area at the turn of the century, that they're going to have to build more and create a bigger reservoir system. So they already had their eyes on this area where the Swift River is. And for the folks who live there, obviously that's not a great place to go, hey, let's, go buy a farm here, when we know within an X number of decades it's going to be flooded. So that is what ends up happening. And the one town that doesn't get flooded, although it gets vacated, is Dana. And the Dana Common, this is actually a marker that we'll come back to in a second. This is the Dana Common here, right on the eastern edge of some of the kind of ancillary areas of the Quabbin, and the Dana Common is here. A little bit closer up, you can see that, this is the main body of the Quabbin, but there are all these various valleys that fill in. And it's an inexact science, particularly in the early 1900s, 1930s, as to how far this is going to flood. So interestingly enough, it does not actually flood Dana Town Common. It gets close, and I'll show you a picture of how close it gets, but the people do have to vacate, and they basically move all the houses, they dig up all the graves, all that kind of stuff. So basically that whole community is taken away. So this is kind of how you get to the Dana Common today. There's a DCR, which is the Department of Conservation and Recreation, basically the Massachusetts State Park System. Used to be part of the MDC, Metropolitan District Commission. If you're familiar with that, it was kind of siphoned off, or actually created about 20 or 30 years ago, and they kind of combined everything and made it DCR. So DCR manages these spaces, and like I said before, they deal with a lot of hikes that go out there. So you get on their email list and stuff like that. Actually, we'll be talking about the prison camp in a second. I actually went on a hike sponsored by DCR just about a year ago for that. But they have many hikes, and actually, I think the Audubon Society does out in Central Mass, has hikes out by the Quabbin. But the major one to get here is the DCR Quabbin Gate 40. It is a pretty good hike, 40 minutes, 1.8 miles into the Common. It is a quasi-paved road, so it's not a strenuous hike from any kind of elevation or something like that. It's basically a kind of broken up paved road that goes for almost 2 miles. So my first time I went there was walking. The second time I did it on a bicycle, which the bicycle is about a 10-minute ride. So that ended up being a lot more efficient. This is the Quabbin Gate 40. Uh, They're usually on the weekends, a lot more people than this, but there is a parking area. There is actually the gate here, so you really can't drive, although vehicles can drive on it if the gate opens up, and we'll see that in a second. DCR uses that from a maintenance perspective. This is a quick video I took of actually riding my bike up to Dane Common. So the beeping you can hear is actually at that day, you can see up here, there was some DCR equipment here, and they were doing some cutting and some kind of land management. So it is maintained. You can see that, the common here is cut and mowed and everything else. This was in April. But when I was up there, actually the only people up there besides me were the DCR employees, but there's actually a porta potty up here as well. So it's, as far as some places 2 miles in the woods, it's a pretty easy access area. And you can see the road here is, I have a road bike as my normal bike, which has very thin tires, so it doesn't really do well on this. I borrowed my daughter's bike, so any kind of hybrid or mountain bike would be very easy to ride this up. Um, the pavement is not great, but it's certainly usable. And this, as I mentioned before, this is just going up, and you can see the blue through the trees. That is the Quabbin, or a kind of offshoot of the Quabbin. So this is from the road that goes into Dana Common. So you can see, it was fairly close. So even though if you're here in the summer, you're not going to see this because all the foliage is going to fill in, and you won't actually think to yourself, well, gee, why did they, evacuate this place since I can't see any water anywhere? But it is actually fairly close. So this was in April before the trees budded out, and you can see that there was actually water pretty close to it. This is a marker that I mentioned before. It was put in place in 1996. These four towns have created, excuse me, there's four societies that basically kind of have reunions. And obviously, these towns were vacated in the 30s. So you're getting to the point of, almost 100 years ago. It's, actually closer to, 90, but the people who were alive during this are becoming fewer and farther between, but their children, so they've maintained a connection to these towns that were flooded during the creation of the Quabbin, and they do have reunions here at this particular Dana Common. I think there's actually for Prescott, there is some roads and some access to the Quabbin that is there, but Dana Common is definitely the most robust of any kind of land around there that's reminiscence of what these towns were. And so the Common is, there aren't any buildings left. And like I said, there's this basic road that was the main drag in the downtown Dana Common. As we'll see, there's kind of cellars that are around here that are still, and this road goes off that way. So from a pure recreational perspective, it's actually a pretty nice area. And like I say, when I was here in the spring a couple of years ago, I was telling Helen before we started, this is one of our COVID trips. I think it was March of 2021. And everybody had cabin fever, and so we went out and walked this, and it was a nice walk, but it was a long walk. But there were people actually having a picnic on the common during that time. Like I said, some of the reunion societies from these towns meet here and have various events during the year. And this is one of the cellars. I think there was actually a hotel downtown. There's a bank, as we'll see in a second. There's actually a leftover safe still there, and there's still just kind of remnants there, rusted things. And this was a pretty robust foundation of a building there. And, it is a eerie place. There's no doubt about that. Particularly when you go there, like I was there, except for the DCR employees off in the woods, I was the only one there. And, it's a little creepy that this place that was once a relatively thriving farming community is gone, and all that's left is this stuff that's been eroding for close to 100 years at this point. But some of the stonework is amazing, and there are some of the walls and foundations, and this is made with very very small stones, and you know not your typical New England stone wall thing. It's obviously a more masonry type thing, and it's pretty neat. And here, I believe, is a part of a bank of a vault, some sort of vault. But it's interesting that we'll see in a couple of other pictures too that there actually are some rusted remnants there that have been laying around for, I said decades, almost to a century. This is a metal something or other. It's a different view of that cellar hole. And, once again, you do have a sense of, what it was a little bit like. I mean, we'll see this a little bit when we get into Dogtown. But one thing about New England is, New England is much more forested today than it was, certainly back in the 1800s. And you read about a lot of this, and we'll get to Henry David Thoreau in a second as well. He kind of pops up at various places around. But, the topography was just very, very a lot more open. And, farmland, so that the land was cleared. There weren't any of these major trees. And they call them second growth forests. So that's a bit of a misnomer. They're kind of like regrowth forests. There've been a lot more than second, of course, in this, 20,000 years or whatever since the glaciers. But, the topography was just much less of, populated by trees back in the day. So these vistas were much more open, and it was mostly farmland. So you get a pretty good view of the surrounding area, where today it's pretty much closed in by trees. Another remnant of a stone wall with actually some rusted implements around. So it is, I find it an interesting place. It really is a very interesting place. And, it does kind of make you, when you start understanding the history, and there have been some books written about it, which I'll get to at the end of the presentation. So if you're more interested in kind of diving down into some of this stuff, it's, the stories are tough. There's no doubt about it. People's homes were eliminated, and they had to move, and they were given, like I said, kind of fair market value. You can make the argument of, was it really fair market value, because the prices have been suppressed since folks had known for decades before that this was kind of in the crosshairs to get flooded. And these were, once again, rural communities, very tight, a couple thousand people each. And this is all that's left. So kind of in the same area and with some tangential kind of relationship, we're going to move to Rutland, Massachusetts. And you see Rutland here, Rutland Prison Camp. And I don't know if folks are familiar with Rutland, Massachusetts. I wasn't that familiar with it until I got involved with this prison camp. But they'll tell you on the welcoming sign to Rutland, it is the geographic center of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So as you can see from this map, it does kind of make total sense, because it's the western part of the state, the eastern part of the state, and the northern part, and the southern part, and boom, right in the middle is the Rutland Prison Camp. And so that ran for basically about 30 years, from 1903 to 1934. And it was actually a farm. It was kind of a self-sustaining farm for the prisoners. Now, it was it was kind of a minimum security prison type of stuff, which I'm not even sure the people who, I mean, a lot of like drunken disorderlies, kind of almost more of a community service type thing. But, they were, they weren't free to kind of roam around. They had to stay in the barracks and all that stuff. And they did have a farm, which both a vegetable farm and a dairy farm. So it was a pretty robust operation. And it was kind of this, quasi-utopian experiment of, could you run a prison and have them actually, create or farm, both from a vegetable perspective and from a animal husbandry perspective with dairy, make it self-sustaining, also be able to, contribute to the markets in the surrounding areas. It was interesting. But it only lasted for about 30 years, and a couple of things come together to kind of end the experiment, which we'll get to. I will say this is my little tip for the day to avoid some of the challenges I ran into when I first went out here. So this is Intervale Road, which is fairly easy to get to from Rutland, and this is Intervale Road. And on a map, this looks very simple. Just kind of go to Intervale Road here, bang the right, go down here, and you end up in Rutland Prison Camp. The challenge is this is a paved road. This is not. And so as you're driving down this road, it's not readily apparent, at least to me it wasn't, that you take the turn here and the road just changes names and goes off down here. And so I was meeting a group actually for a DCR hike, and I ended up getting horribly lost and had to come circle all the way around and actually come in this way to the MDC road, which I don't know, I would say it probably took me like 15, 20 minutes to do that. Subsequent times I've been there, I am wise to this. This road is closed a lot. I have been here in the spring and the winter, and it was closed. In the summer, I think it's open. It's very drivable. We'll see a picture of it in a second. So it's pretty quick to get off the road, and there's a parking lot right here by the Rutland prison camp. It's only about a 13-minute hike in, but this is the little gotcha right here, that there is a little kind of a pull off, a parking area, and besides that, there is no indication that it goes from Intervale Road to Chemack Hill Road. So this is a little bit more detail on that. Once again, this is, kind of a gravel dirt road here. It's a 13-minute walk in. And like I said, the gate is open in the summer, so it's just a fairly quick drive in there. This does flood sometimes. They had to do some repair work because of the watershed, and particularly, once again, ironically enough, we're in a drought now, but this past winter and spring, we actually got a lot of precipitation. So part of the road did wash out during the winter, and they had to fill it in, but they have fixed it since then. And that is the road. So you see, it's, pretty usable road, for definitely very usable for a car, no special equipment needed. And as I mentioned, I was on the tour there. And the problem with this place is it's really in the middle of nowhere. It's in the middle of the state, but it is in the middle of nowhere. But I guess it has become a go-to place for graffiti. So there's a whole mess of graffiti all through these places, which is very disconcerting, particularly since you're in the middle of this, bucolic area and there's all this tagging going on. And, I know particularly if you spend a lot of time in Europe, that is a huge thing and it's considered art in some cities. And some of the stuff here we'll see does get kind of interesting, but they have tried to remove it and they removed it, and the folks come back and, graffiti it all over again. So they've kind of given up on that. But unfortunately, that's what you see on a lot of the structures that are left from the prison camp. This is the solitary confinement building. And the tour guide, so I had a DCR tour the first time I went out there, and she was talking about how just kind of odd this was, because these people had, they had really good food. They had pretty good accommodations. It was a prison, but as far as prisons go, it was pretty lax. There wasn't a huge, perimeter of barbed wire or anything like that. So, you know, in general, it was a pretty decent place to be if you have to be in a place like that. But still, people misbehaved, and they had, I think it's 4 or 5 cells here for solitary confinement. So that was still necessary and was still used. And you can see from a aerial shot that it's starting to fall in. The roof is starting to cave in. Actually, we were there in the tour. Some people had climbed up and were on the roof. We were actually over here by the cellar that we'll see in a second. And the tour guy was yelling for the people to get off. As you can see, this is not a great place to stand. But there is some fairly significant graffiti there. This one in particular, almost like the It Clown type of thing going on. And this is a wall that's right next to it. But that is all in the middle of the forest out there in Rutland, Massachusetts. And this is the vegetable cellar, which the tour guide said is not officially safe to go in. Of course, that didn't stop us from going in, but there was a root cellar type of thing where they would store vegetables. You can see it was literally built into the side of a hill here. And it's probably the most interesting structure that's still left in Rutland. And once again, the taggers got into that, but you can see that, how robust this whole thing was. And it was pretty large for storing a lot of the vegetables that they actually grew on the property. And on top of that, in addition to that, this was also the location for the tuberculosis sanatorium for the Massachusetts correctional system at the time. So the difference with that is that included prisoners from all over the state. So it wasn't just minimum security. So this sanatorium actually had to be a fully secure location, because some of the prisoners who were here, who were, recuperating, or, a lot of the things that went on as the, TB is, it's once again, kind of go back to Thoreau. He and his brother, he passed away of TB. His brother actually passed of lockjaw. But TB is a huge thing, particularly in the 1800s. It is, you can't really read something without somebody being affected by TB, either, themselves. It can be long gestation, like Thoreau kind of had TB, they think, for most of his adult life. He died at 44. But it was a big thing. And so a lot of people were with TB. There was all kinds of different thoughts about fresh air. This sanatorium was quite an edifice, you see. So there is a metal fence, but you see the structure. It is huge. There's actually was like a porch where some of the therapy was you were outside the whole time, 365 days a year. So once again, you think about central Massachusetts in the middle of January, February, that can be a rough place, particularly even rougher. 100 years ago, climate was even colder than it is now. But it's a large structure. So there are remnants of it. There's some pilings there. What they've done actually in the time that I've been there, in the year that I've been going there, they actually during the winter cut down a lot of the trees. So you can see the foundation. This is done after the trees were cut down. When I was there the first time, trees were here, and you really, kind of had to walk around and, poke your nose in and, get a kind of a sense of how big the place was because all this was populated by forest, basically. Once again, things had grown back up. But during the winter, they actually, then the guy told us they were going to do it during the winter, and they did. Since the winter wasn't that snowy, they were able to remove most of the trees. So if you go there now, you get a much broader sense of what the foundation was like. But it was a large edifice. So that was at that location, but once again, a much more secure location than the actual prison itself. And this is more of the kind of foundation that goes around it. And you can see the tree stumps here that they were cut down over the winter. This is taken actually before the trees were cut, so you can see that there was a good amount of it here, and you do have this incredibly bucolic view over the valley. This was taken in yeah, it's November. This is November of last year, so right around this time, still some color in the trees. And as far as the sanatoriums in those days, there's a lot of them up in the mountains, the Adirondacks, various places, the White Mountains. They had these tuberculosis sanatoriums, and the I thought was that fresh air, that clean fresh air, would be good for the lungs and would help either slow tuberculosis or potentially cure it. Of course, it didn't really cure it. It's a bacterial thing, but there are all different levels of tuberculosis. And I said some people did live with it for a long time, and I said Thoreau did himself. But it's hard to see stories in the 1800s without some sort of impact of TB. And there's the steps, one of the steps that was up to the sanatorium. And they do have a cemetery since people did pass away there. Obviously, in the sanatorium, they passed away, and I think some of the folks passed away in the minimum security prison as well. So there are headstones and the road leading to the uh, prison. And this is a picture of the actual dairy farm. And once again, you see this is a very, very substantial structure, and it plays into the fact of why the prison camp is no longer there. It's the Quabbin, and I'll show you in a second. The watershed for the Quabbin is large. And so when they were building the Quabbin, they wanted to have as clean water as possible. So they were not excited about having dairy farms and that kind of stuff with all the manure and everything else, right close to what becomes the sources for the Quabbin. So as a result, this prison camp is considered part of the Ware River watershed, which the Ware River is something that feeds into the Quabbin. The Swift River is the main river that creates the Quabbin, but the Ware River flows into it. So they decided in the midst of the Depression that they would close down this prison camp because they had to keep the Quabbin. You see here the Ware River watershed. It's kind of, not kind of, but is in between the Wachusett Reservoir here on the east and the Quabbin Reservoir here on the west. So very integral into this whole space that creates all the water for the Quabbin and the Wachusett Reservoir. So they decided to shut it down. And as I mentioned before, the winter we had last year with a lot of water, this is actually the road I showed you at the beginning that goes into the prison camp. It got washed out. And so when I was here in the spring this year, it actually was not passable from a vehicle perspective. When I came back later, they had filled it in, but you can see once again, how close the water is. So the actual dairy farm is kind of up here, right down this road, up on the left. And this is water that goes into the Ware River watershed. So as a result, you see that there's, a direct impact here. And so the decision was to shut down the prison camp and shut down the dairy farm. So we will take a kind of a left turn, left turn, it's more of a right turn, I guess, but a left turn as far as topics go, and head out to Cape Ann. So Cape Ann, as you know, probably is home to Gloucester and Rockport. It's actually an island, officially. There's actually a thing called the Cut, which really makes Cape Ann a island. And in the center of it is this kind of wasteland called Dogtown. And it's become a mythical place. It's it became in the original settlements of Gloucester Rockport. I guess a lot of the population was kind of up here, but they started migrating toward the ocean as um, seafood and fishing becomes a major, not a major, the major industry here. Of course, Rockport also, the name is Rockport is because out here at the name escapes me at the end of Rockport, but Halibut Point, there is quarrying for rock. And so those become the two commercial things that go on in Cape Ann. And so the population migrates toward the water. And as a result, Dogtown gets quasi abandoned. Lots of dogs, supposedly, hence the name, although it's kind of unclear as to exactly what derived the name for Dogtown. But there's a lot of that ends up being the population here and kind of, off by themselves. Once again, you end up with cellar holes and remnants of what's left in that area. But it's also a pretty interesting geological area. And it's a very, very direct manifestation of a lot of what New England, quite frankly, is geography is created by the last ice age. So it's a pretty fascinating place. It's got some myth around it. There was a murder that was committed there, I think, in the 80s. A book was written about it, a really good book written about 10 or so years ago that goes into the whole murder and then it kind of expands upon that with the whole story of Dogtown. And, it's an interesting place. I will say, when you read about Dogtown, you cannot hear that it's easy to get lost in Dogtown. And even in these days of GPS and everything else, I will fully support that. Is just a very confusing place to be in, and I'm not quite sure why, but you see it's pretty big. But it is definitely, you want to go in there with a healthy amount of respect for getting yourself out of there. So about the glaciers, pretty interesting. The glaciers receded when, 12, 15,000 years ago. And the Laurentide ice sheet is the one that, got this far south into the United States. So you see the northern part of the United States was pretty much covered in glaciers. Just a side note, this is kind of a different map, but my brother lives in Wisconsin, and this is actually called the driftless area. And the reason they call it the driftless area, because it was not, for whatever reason, covered by glacier. So the topography of kind of central and southwestern Wisconsin is different than the rest of the state. It's absolutely gorgeous, but it's interesting. And so as you see, kind of the end of these glaciers really kind of hugs the coastline here of New England and up through maritime Canada, Nova Scotia, and up to Newfoundland. So a large impact in the topography that we have up here in New England, and Dogtown is a very, very visceral manifestation of that. And so you see that these, terminal moraine is basically where the glacier ends. And so obviously you see a lot of different debris there since the glacier is, pushing out and it's churning up all this, stuff from the crust and all these erratic rocks and everything else. And it's pushing it to the end, kind of like when you see the tide line. You see seaweed in the tide. When the tide brings it in, you see the tide line, and that's where all the seaweed and shells are and everything. And so you can see from the glacier here that this is right around the tip of Cape Ann, ends up being the terminal moraine. And you see various things here. This is Lake Albany. I said I grew up in the Albany area, and this is basically the Hudson River Valley. There's a huge, huge lake here during the Ice Age, and there's Lake Hitchcock here, which is really between New Hampshire and Vermont, and Lake Connecticut, which is basically Long Island Sound. So a lot of the topography that we see here in the Northeast is directly related to what happened in the glaciers about 12 to 15,000 years ago. And this is a little bit better representation of what's happening with the ice sheet, churning this stuff up as it recedes. It leaves these things, it scours the earth. You get these drumlins, which are very, very common to New England. You get the kettle ponds, which Walden Pond is one of those. You get the ground moraine and the end or slash terminal moraine. And then as the um, uh, glacier melts, you get this water that flows out into the ocean. So that's actually what happened with the Hudson River Valley. Kind of an ice dam broke north around Lake Champlain and ended up flooding all the way down and out into the Atlantic Ocean and kind of create a lot of what we know today as Hudson Valley. But this end moraine type of thing creates a lot of what we see in Dogtown. And as I mentioned, my friend Henry David Thoreau, he gets around. He's kind of amazing in the fact that he pops up everywhere. And at some point, I think next year I'm gonna have to do some sort of presentation on him because I just keep on running into him, and he's all over the place. And he's actually in two places that we're going to talk about today, one of which is Dogtown. So he goes to Dogtown about 4 years, yeah, 4 years before his death. He died in 1862. And he said, we could see no house but the hills strewn with boulders as if they had rained down on every side, we sitting under a shelving one. When the moon rose, what had appeared like immense boulders half a mile off on the horizon now looked by contrast no larger than nutshells or burry nut against the moon's disk. And she was the biggest boulder of all. So this brings us to historic Dogtown, established in 1641. So this is right around the early settlement times of Cape Ann. And it's a parking lot. There is a shooting range right over here. So because you can know you're close to this parking lot, we can hear the guns going off. And there are a bunch of trails around here, but I said it's kind of a confusing place to get around. And this is kind of what you're looking at. So all the stuff I talked about as far as terminal moraines and rocks and glacier and all that stuff, this is there. It looks like somebody just dropped a bunch of rocks and sprinkled them all over around. So it's an incredibly foreboding landscape. And you can imagine of what it was like to try and farm on this. I think I have a picture here from probably the early 1900s, late 1800s, of what it actually looked like. They had, raising pigs. I think there were some sheep around here as well. Going to be kind of a rough place to do any kind of vegetable farming, but it's a pretty forbidding place. And like I said, it became kind of a place for outcasts. And the main business of certainly Gloucester is fishing, and the quarrying that happened in Rockport. And of course, there's also fishing out of Rockport as well. We'll get to this in a second. There are actually a lot of rocks with markings on them. But once again, you can see that, there are paths through there. And if you wander off the path, it's a lot of scrambling over rocks. There's just absolutely no doubt you have a lot of the granite rocks that are strewn out here covered in lichen. And as I mentioned, erratics, which are these large boulders that the glacier moves from another area. And, Dogtown is just a fascinating example of a lot of the stuff that happens. You see this Jagunda erratic, and obviously the tree is growing around it. And so, these are extremely, extremely large boulders. And you think, once again, kind of wish I had somebody standing next to this, give a little bit more of a scale, but it's a very, very large rock. And you get an idea of what the power of the glacier must have been to move these things and deposit them miles and miles away from where they originally are. So a very, very powerful geological event that happens with the glaciers. And so they're actually, talking about reservoirs, we talked about the Quabbin and Wachusett, actually on Cape Ann. I don't know if these are the only two reservoirs. I do believe they're the main reservoirs, are the Goose Cove Reservoir and the Babson Reservoir, which are both on the edge of Dogtown. This is kind of the main Dogtown Square per se. This is Sportsman Club, as I mentioned. That's where the firing range is. This is kind of where I parked here. You kind of, I'm not sure if it was here or here, but you might have been here. And you walk in, and there's actually a big composting space as well. So they use the area for composting. So they have all the leaf bags and everything are in there. And then there's some pretty robust trails that go off and up this way to Dogtown Square, and kind of off this way to the reservoir. And this is the reservoir. I was there actually a number of years ago in the winter, and the reservoir froze over, and you can see that there's some sort of pump house, and there are fairly large bodies of water that supply the water for Cape Ann. And probably the most famous thing about Dogtown is the Babson Boulder Trail. So these are boulders that are engraved with various supposedly inspirational messages. So this one's a twofer. You have study on one side, be on time on the other. It looks like their stencil didn't do great with spacing between the word be and on, but it's a pretty interesting story. So Roger Babson is the namesake of Babson College, and he lived from late 1800s to the mid 1900s. He was an economist, an entrepreneur, a business theorist, kind of a man of many trades, and he donated slash sold about 1,000 of the acres that make up Dogtown. And in the context of that, this is during the Depression, and he wanted to use it as kind of an inspirational place that, people who can hike through here will be seeing these pithy phrases throughout there, and it will spur them on to greater things. So this says the work I'm doing is part of an educational plan, which will take some years to complete. I believe young people, when outdoors, should see something besides advertisements to smoke certain brands of cigarettes and to use soaps to return that schoolgirl complexion. So even back in the 1930s, consumerism was certainly alive and well, and he thought having pithy sayings on stones in the woods might combat that. So there is a whole Babson Boulder Trail, which when you take Dogtown Road, which is kind of the main drag from the parking lot that I was in, and you kind of go up to here and you end up, there are some of the ones up here, some few that are up here, then most of them go down this way and make their way to, appropriately enough, the Babson Reservoir. And so these are actually all of the ones there and their actual coordinates, which is, I think, the first one's kind of funny. Get a job, help mother, save, be clean. It's interesting. It's really interesting to kind of wander through this, really interesting glacial landscape, and then you have a bunch of things with these engraved in it. Ideas, be on time, industry, integrity, initiative. And once again, I'm not sure how many people who are walking through the woods and see this and say, oh my gosh, I wouldn't have had any initiative until I saw that carved into a rock, but he thought so. And to this day, it's, one of those kind of odd New England type things, which makes it a kind of interesting place. And, use your head, I think was one of my favorites. Some mushrooms to it. So as I mentioned before, I do have a predilection to talk about art as well as history, and Dogtown kind of encapsulates that as well. The mid-century modernist painter who's from Maine, Marsden Hartley, actually used Dogtown as a subject for a lot of his paintings. And so he is a contemporary of Georgia O'Keeffe, Arthur Dove, and Alfred Stieglitz. He visits Dogtown 3 times in the 20s and 30s. And there was actually a show at the Cape Ann Museum in Gloucester back about 12 years ago or so called Soliloquy in Dogtown. And it was a show of Hartley's paintings that he did of Dogtown. So he did write an autobiography. Once again, it's kind of similar to Thoreau's description, but seagulls fly over it on the way from the marshes to the sea. Otherwise, the place is forsaken and majestically lonely, as if nature had at last formed one spot where she could live herself alone. So it definitely, spurs some of those really kind of solitary, lonely type feelings, and he was inspired there, and so he creates these, modernistic paintings with some very, very garish colors, and interesting subject for that. And once again, he's there in the 20s and 30s, and the forest is a lot less than what it is today. So you get a lot broader view of the kind of harsh landscape that you have out in Dogtown. So with that, we will move further west into New Hampshire and wrap up in the Madame Sherri Forest. So as you can see, this is Pisgah State Park. We have Keene, New Hampshire up here. This is actually the stairway. Left of the stairway that goes. This actually section just fell within I think the last year, and that's one of the reasons that kind of spurred me to go up here, because what I've been reading is get there while any of it's still left, because it is collapsing. And once again, the thawing and freezing of the New Hampshire winter is just wreaking havoc on the stone structure. And that area, everything kind of revolves around Mount Monadnock. And so it's called the Monadnock region. And it's kind of in the center, and you have Jaffrey, you have Keene, Peterborough's in the area. And once again, our friend Henry David Thoreau ends up there. He hikes Monadnock a couple of different times, of course, writes about it. And once again, his view from Monadnock is much different than what we have today, because in his day, in the mid 1800s, there was all farmland. And so there really weren't that many trees. But he has a lot to say about Mount Monadnock. And, it is amazing that everybody knows Walden. and all that, and conquered with Thoreau, and he kind of gets a reputation as a hermit and those type of things, which is really kind of a misinterpretation of what he was doing in Walden. But he traveled a lot, particularly for a guy in the early to mid 1800s. He's down in Cape Cod, he's up in Canada. I think he actually ended up out in the Great Lakes. He's up in Maine at Mount Katahdin. Obviously goes up in the Concord Merrimack River with his brother, which is his first book. He writes about it, but he really does get around. I mean, it's kind of interesting because he is, considered this, sage of Concord, and he was uber observational about Concord, and his journals and his notes. You can actually date all kinds of spring flowering, and based on his journals, they say that spring is about 1 to 2 weeks later now than it was in the mid 1800s. Very detailed, and you think that he spent all his time in Concord, and he certainly did and was very observational, but he got around. And you think in those days he was traveling mostly by foot or by, canoe, and it's pretty incredible. So this once again is off a paved road. It's kind of like the road by Rutland prison camps. It's in good shape, but it is not a paved road. In order to get to Madame Cherie's forest, you do have to take a gravel/dirt road, and you end up there. It's actually officially in Chesterfield, New Hampshire, and there are some period pictures of her time, kind of a 1920s flapper, roaring 20s type person to the nth degree. See here that this is a photograph of the description of kind of the whole Madame Cherie story. She is born in France as a singer and dancer, but actually ends up in New York and becomes kind of a kind of costumer to a lot of the vaudeville that's going on, even is supplying the Ziegfeld Follies. And she has a protege, a gentleman named Charles Lemaire, who himself becomes a legendary costume designer and is nominated for 17 Academy Awards for costume design. And so her husband dies prematurely in 1924, and with Lemaire as kind of her protector and financial provider, she ends up locating to this area in the woods of New Hampshire, which has a summer party scene, and as an actor, Jack Henderson, who lives in the area. And she basically, with financial assistance from Lemaire, buys a piece of land and kind of builds this castle. And it's a summer entertainment for her friends, who are theater actors, vaudeville performers, clothing models. And so it's kind of interesting when you start understanding that area, that kind of broad Monadnock area. There is a lot of art stuff going on there. I mean, you have Peterborough with the McDowell Retreat, which is where Thornton Wilder wrote Our Town, very much of an art colony. You have Dublin, New Hampshire, which is kind of an art colony. You have Jaffrey and you have Keene, which have summer stock. So it becomes kind of this relatively minor, but still very robust area for folks of that bent. And actually, this is a little known fact, but the author Willa Cather, the famous one for Pioneers, and basically most of her books folks know her for are based in the plains in Nebraska. She's actually buried in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, overlooking Monadnock. And this was an area that she found very, very special and spent a lot of time there, a lot of summers there. And so is actually buried in a cemetery there overlooking Monadnock and Jaffrey, which is, once again, one of those great trivia questions. I never would have thought that Willa Cather was buried in Western New Hampshire. So this is what Madame Cherie ends up doing. And this is a picture of the castle as it was in its day before it starts collapsing. And this is it today. So it's not a very long hike from the parking lot. It's, I don't know, 10 minutes or so. It's very easy to get once you get to the parking lot. But so you have to go on a dirt/gravel road to get there, and GPS can get a little funky when that happens. But once you're actually at the parking lot, this is a short hike, and you can see this is what they're talking about. This one in particular looks like it's probably going to go sooner rather than later. So it is once again kind of a little bit of a creepy thing. This is actually infrared picture that gives it a little bit more of a creepiness factor. Makes all the foliage white and in black and white, but you have this kind of staircase to nowhere going on, and this is a staircase to the front of the house, and this was the grand staircase that went to the side of the house. And this is the foundation. It's kind of eroding away, and a fireplace that's still left there, and other steps that goes up to the front, and some of the supports that were there. So there's, obviously the stuff that is wood is pretty much gone, except for some of that stuff we saw at the at the base level, but the stone is still there, and the Mother Nature is taking it over. So it is kind of an interesting space to look at. There's actually right near a little pond right near it with a beaver lodge there for your viewing enjoyment. So you're right into the midst of the woods of New Hampshire. So that pretty much takes us around those various areas. And I will say that they're definitely off the beaten path, and they take a little bit of research to find out, how to get to them. None of them are, you know, impossible to get to. Not a lot of, incredible hiking to get there. It is, like I said, some kind of funky stuff off the road, and on gravel paths, and you get into the whole space of where GPS doesn't necessarily always work 100%. But they're fascinating stories, and within New England, we're blessed here that we have this kind of wide variety of topography. We can go from the coast, we can go to the mountains, we can go into the interior and the woods and the lakes and all that. And so there's some pretty interesting stories that are, all the way throughout. These ones are quasi tied together from a reservoir water source perspective, which is something that's becoming increasingly more important. Obviously, right now it's fairly acute around here that we're in a 5 month or so drought. And we seem to be going through this kind of whipsaw thing where we have either it's a very, very rainy deluge, or it's a drought. We basically had a drought in the summer of 2022, kind of had a deluge in the summer of 2023. This year has been a hybrid. It was very wet for the first part of the year, very dry for the second part of the year. And so these reservoirs and stuff are incredibly important. And the story of how they're created where they are is really interesting. And particularly the one with the Quabbin it's a really, kind of a classic civil engineering, public versus private impact type of thing. And, kind of the challenges that happen when those things are created, quote unquote, for the greater good. But as Helen said, I'm a photographer. This is actually when I was up taking photographs of the eclipse in Vermont back in April, which was kind of a cool experience. Mother Nature really cooperated on that one. But I am on Instagram at bmagphoto, on Facebook at Bruce J. Magnuson Photography, and on the web at brucemagnuson.smugmug.com. So, further reading, as I mentioned, particularly with the Quabbin and Dogtown, there's actually a fairly good number of I think, pretty decent books. On the Quabbin, it was actually a novel that was written about 10 years or so ago that is based on one of the towns there. And it really gives you a good sense of what happens with these people when, the town you've grown up in and your ancestors have grown up in is going to go away, and what that really means. It's tough for us, 100 years in the future to kind of project ourselves into that, but that novel kind of gives a good sense of what it was like. And then there are more contemporary books that have been written about the actual lost town to the Swift River Valley. And Dogtown, the book I would highly recommend is Dogtown, Death and Enchantment in a New England Ghost Town, written by Melissa East back about 13 years or so ago. And that's the one that goes into the murder that happened in Dogtown in the 80s and kind of expands upon the whole thing. But actually, based on that murder, oddly enough, it did give more focus to Dogtown and made it more of a approachable area. It really was an abandoned area that was, there was drug use going on, and it was a very, very dangerous place. And people just really, stay away from Dogtown. And when the murder brought a lot of focus on it, the only good thing probably out of it was the fact that it did bring, particularly the folks of Gloucester who are in the town lines that Dogtown exists, to put more focus on this as a public space. And it is an amazing amount of property in the middle of Cape Ann, which is, one of the gorgeous parts of Massachusetts. So, and there was actually a novel that was written about Anita Demont that takes place in the 1800s in Dogtown. And like I said, there was a exhibition book about Harsley's show at the Cape Ann Museum. So in a month, we're going to take a 180-degree turn or a 5,000-mile-degree turn and head out to Greece. And I'll be talking about a Greek Odyssey, Athens, Delphi, Crete, and a Fulbright Fellow. My daughter had the privilege of spending a year in Greece as a Fulbright Fellow a couple of years ago. And so my wife and I took a couple of trips to Greece. And I use that as a basis for kind of talking a lot about a pretty fascinating place. So with that, I will open it up to any questions folks may have. Thanks so much for your attention.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. If anyone has any questions, feel free to enter them into the Q&A or chat. And I was just curious, Bruce, how did you find these places? I mean, they're very unique, not your typical places that people would visit if they were saying, "Oh, I want to go on a hike"? Like, how did you find these places?
Well, it's an interesting question. The Quabbin, so this is a little bit of a long story, but my mother grew up in Belmont. She grew up in the Boston area, although we moved out to Albany with my father. But she had a job in the summer when she was in college, and the job was for a guy who worked for the MDC, the Metropolitan District Commission, and this was in the late 40s and early 50s. And his job was to really document those towns. So when I was growing up, she would always talk about the Quabbin and this job, and it meant nothing to me. I didn't have any idea what the Quabbin was. And one time I moved out here, and it was one of those things that the seed was planted in my mind. And then once a photographer friend of mine, a guy named Skip Scheel, based out of Cambridge, he has done the Quabbin as a subject of his, and he's been photographing it for decades. And so those two things kind of prompted me to kind of investigate it more. And once you get in to the whole story of the Quabbin, and these books, some of those books I mentioned have been written pretty recently. So I think people are becoming a little bit more aware of what it is and what happened there and the whole story behind it. So it's just one of those things. And I moved from, like I said, I was in Melrose and now I'm out here in Chelmsford. And so the Quabbin really isn't that far away. So it's one of those places that it just became, because it's just a skip, place to go photograph. Dogtown is once again, I used to spend a lot of time up in Cape Ann, and it was this mythical place. And like I said, it had this reputation of being this dangerous place and all this stuff. And so, once again, I was in a photography group that was had been formed by Skip at the Cambridge Center for Adult Education back in the late '90s, and we did a trip up to Dogtown, probably around 2003, 2004. And so that was my introduction to Dogtown. And Madame Cherie was just something that I had become kind of interested in the Keene area, and I was doing a photography project for a group I'm a member of up in New Hampshire, and we're photographing old buildings that are 200 years older or more. Madame Cherie building does not meet that, but I was doing a lot of research in the area and kind of became aware of this particular thing. And once again, it gets mentioned a lot in articles about, hikes to do in New England. And Madame Sherri Forest will come up a lot. So those kind of things came together and said, oh, this might be a place to explore. And so I have to admit, that's the only one for this presentation. I went specifically to that place for this presentation. I had not been there before, and I was wanting to add another place to this presentation. So I kind of used that as an excuse, and I went up to Madame Cherie's this spring to kind of check it out. So that's how it happens. So, but a lot of these things are just kind of like the Thoreau thing. You will see a presentation from me probably next year on Thoreau, and it's just one of those things where he just keeps coming up so much. And there's a cottage industry for him, and obviously, actually, a friend of mine just written a book called Thoreau's God. Richard Higgins is doing a program tonight in Concord on it. And he's become kind of the patron saint of environmentalism and all this stuff, but he is just such an incredibly interesting guy, and he just pops up all over the place, which I wasn't even aware of. So I'm kind of like, something speaking to me of like, okay, I've come across him so many times, and I've started to photograph Walden Pond, because one of the benefits of DCR, once you reach 62, you can get for $10 a lifelong pass to park free at DCR areas, except for the Quabbin, oddly enough. But it does include Walden Pond. So one of my goals is to spend a lot of time at Walden Pond and photograph that over the next year.
Great, thank you. Thank you for joining us tonight. We have two more programs with Bruce. As he mentioned, in December on the 11th, we have Greek Odyssey, Athens, Delphi, Crete, and a Fulbright Fellow. And in January, we will be taking a look at Articlo, Photographer's Journey Through Iceland's Midnight Sun. So hope we will see you then. Thank you again for joining us. And thanks again, Bruce.
Great. Thanks, Helen. Thanks, everyone.